Every parent believes their child is safe at night. That moment when you check the locks, kiss your children goodnight, and set the alarm. We create routines, security measures, layers of protection. But in June 2002, in Salt Lake City, one family's split-second decision to skip setting their alarm would trigger a chain of events that would force every parent in America to ask themselves, how safe are your children really, even in their own beds? How sure are you that someone hasn't already been inside your home, watching, waiting, planning? For the Smart family, these weren't just hypothetical questions. They were about to become their reality. The loving parents had 6 children, among them 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart, who was born in 1987 in Salt Lake City, Utah. She was a quiet, shy girl, one of 6 children of Edward and Lois Smart. The teenager had several hobbies. She rode horses and ran long distances. The girl was described as a smart, obedient, and shy child. She showed great promise for a successful future. As a child, her passion was the harp, which she began playing at the age of 5 and practiced for hours every day. And when Elizabeth entered Bryant Middle School, she began to be invited to perform at various city events. Whether it was a wedding or a concert in honor of another celebration, she was also an experienced rider and long-distance runner. She participated in various school competitions. In general terms, she did not waste time, and her parents were proud of her achievements. On June 4th, 2002, Elizabeth woke up in a good mood. She was looking forward to the upcoming events. The girl washed her face, had breakfast with her family, and went to school with her parents, where she received several awards for successfully completing the school year. Finally, the school year was over, and a whole summer of planned trips with family was ahead. Afterwards, the Smart family spent the day together. The last happy day, and returning home, they went to bed. Every night before bed, Edward would set the alarm on the doors of the house. But on this very evening, he decided to turn off the alarm, locking the doors only. He was afraid that the alarm might go off if one of the children wanted to go outside at night. How terrible it is to realize that the tragedy could have been avoided by just a small press of a finger on the alarm button. Before going to bed, the girls loved to read, and so it was on June 4th. When they got tired of the books, they went to sleep, but this night was not as calm as usual. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Elizabeth was awakened by an unknown man. He put a knife to her throat and calmly said, "Quiet, and don't even try to scream. Get out of bed and come with me, or I will kill you and your family." The girl was terrified, and if she had started screaming, her parents would have been in that room very quickly. But it was not known how this man would react to the scream. He could hurt her, Mary, and possibly other members of her family. She couldn't let that happen, so she did what he told her to do. After they were outside, he forced her to walk towards the woods. After some time, they approached a road. In the darkness, the bright light of headlights from an oncoming car appeared. Elizabeth thought this might be her salvation, but the man pushed her into the bushes and forbade her to move. She noticed that it was a police car, but decided not to do anything. The car just drove past them and disappeared from view in an instant. They immediately continued their way into the forest. The journey to the destination took several hours and was very tiring for the girl. At the same time, Elizabeth's sister decided to leave the room 2 hours after the abduction and go to her parents' bedroom. As it turned out, she had witnessed everything that had happened and had seen the man taking Elizabeth out of the room, but she pretended to be asleep so as not to draw attention to herself. Mary left the room as soon as her sister and the man were out of sight, but in the hallway she noticed that he was still in the house, so she quickly returned to bed. She was so frightened by this fact that she could not get out from under the covers for a long time. She was afraid that the kidnapper might still be in her house. It was only around 4 in the morning that she told her parents about her sister's abduction. At first, Ed and Lois did not believe what the 9-year-old girl was saying. They were convinced that it was just a bad dream, but the girl insisted that Elizabeth was not in bed. She had left the house with some man. Although the parents were not completely sure that Mary was telling the truth, they decided to check it out. Seeing that their daughter was indeed not at home, they began to inspect all the rooms, and only when Lois entered the kitchen, she noticed that the mosquito net on the window was cut. The girl's parents immediately called the police, and then their closest relatives. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the house was full of friends and relatives, all of whom wanted to help in the search. Unfortunately, The police did not cordon off the crime scene immediately after the report, and the arrival of a large group of people at the house led to the fact that no evidence could be recorded in the future. Everything was contaminated or destroyed. The police questioned the only witness. She said that the man was dressed all in black, and he had gloves on his hands. She could not see his face because it was too dark in the room, but she had heard his voice before. It sounded very familiar. The very next day after the girl's disappearance, information appeared on television. On behalf of the family, Ed spoke in a faltering voice, asking the kidnapper to release his daughter. Ed's call made a strong impression on the members of the community. The next morning they were met by almost 500 volunteers who were ready to help in the search for Elizabeth, and by the end of the day, there were almost 2,000 of them. Soon the whole city knew what 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart looked like. There was not a single person who did not experience horror upon learning about the girl's abduction. Parents walked their children to school by the hand. Children were not allowed to walk unsupervised and wander far from home. Every resident of Salt Lake City followed the details of the case with bated breath. But unfortunately, the sniffer dogs were unable to pick up the trail. The girl seemed to have vanished with the mysterious stranger. Meanwhile, the kidnapper was leading the girl far from the abduction site. It was a road through the forest, and it was long and tedious. The girl knew what could happen to her. Elizabeth asked the kidnapper to do what he was going to do closer to her home, so that her family could quickly find her body. However, the man, who introduced himself as Emmanuel, kept walking until they reached a place where his camp was located. Among the trees, they pitched a tent and spread out a tarp on the ground. There he had a camp where he lived with his 40-year-old wife Wanda Ellen Barzy. When they finally reached this camp, the girl was forced to undress. Brian said he was an angel sent to save the earth from the Antichrists. He is God's prophet who hears instructions from on high, and the first instruction was to save the 14-year-old girl by taking her as his wife. He planned to kidnap and take many girls as his wives, but by a tragic coincidence, Elizabeth Smart was the first and partly the last. Brian forced her to take communion and take a new name before she entered into a sacred union with him. Mitchell allowed the girl to choose a name on her own, but under one condition. The name had to be from the Old Testament. Elizabeth chose the name Esther. That was the name she was called for the next 9 months. After that, he raped her and tied her to a tree so she wouldn't run away. His wife Wanda watched all this. She was just as mentally abnormal and obsessed with the made-up faith as her husband. Lizzie couldn't run away. The rope she was tied to the tree with would not let her go far from the camp. The girl could only go a certain distance. She was like a dog on a leash. Every time Lizzie thought about her family, David became irritated. He threatened to kill them all if she tried to escape. He told her to forget about her family, that she would never see them again. But this only gave Elizabeth strength. She thought that if she tried to please them, they would not kill her. And from the very first day of captivity, Lizzie tried to carry out any orders. She helped clean up the camp and prepared food. She even pretended to be a good listener when Wanda and Brian told her about their lives. But everything was only getting worse. He raped her every day. It even happened that he could satisfy his needs up to 4 times a day. Once Wanda didn't like that her husband was spending a lot of time with the young girl. And then Brian made a schedule that he would be with her every day and with Lizzie every night. This nightmare seemed to last endlessly long until David began going to town. Sometimes he could disappear for days, leaving Wanda and Lizzie without food and water. And when he returned, he forced his exhausted from hunger and thirst victim to drink alcohol. Otherwise, she would remain without food for another day. Lizzie had no choice but to obey, playing the role of an obedient captive. Over time, the girl herself began to ask for something stronger. She did not want to be sober when it came to violence. She was so exhausted and morally drained that there seemed to be no other way to escape this pain. The girl had already recognized her kidnapper. A few months ago, when she and her mother were walking the streets of the city, they noticed a man who asked them for money. Lois gave him $5 and her husband's business card, saying that he might have a job for him. The Smart family lived in a very large house, and they often needed someone who could help with repairs. Sometime later, Emmanuel appeared at their house, helping with work on the roof. It was then that he had the opportunity to meet Elizabeth. Now he looked different. He had a long beard, which he did not have before. She just could not understand why this man was repaying her family's kindness in this way. Soon the kidnappers began to trust her. They took her with them to the city, but in order for Lizzie not to be recognized, she was dressed in a white burqa, her face covered with a veil. And every time they left the camp, Brian intimidated the girl. He reminded her that if she ran away, he knew where her family lived. They went to the store, attended parties, walked the streets. Going to town for the girl was the hope that someone might recognize her and save her. However, this did not happen. At the same time, investigators were still investigating the case. They tried to establish who the kidnapper could be. Noting that Elizabeth's house was being renovated, the police took a closer look at the workers. It turned out that in the months leading up to the girl's abduction, dozens of people had gone through their house. After studying each one, their attention was drawn to Richard Ricci. Until recently, he had been detained for attempting to murder a police officer, but he was soon released on parole. After searching his house, stolen items were found. Some of them belonged to the Smart family. This was enough for the police to make him the prime suspect. They believed that perhaps he had wanted to rob the Smarts, but the girl had woken up and seen him. He could not afford to be recognized, so he took her with him. Ricci was interrogated for several hours, but he denied any involvement in Elizabeth's kidnapping. The police put more and more pressure on him, trying to force him to confess, but the man never admitted his guilt. Mary, seeing his photo on television, immediately stated that this was not the man they were looking for, but the police did not believe the words of the 9-year-old child. He continued to be held in custody and interrogated. As a result, in August, Richard was taken to the hospital with a cerebral hemorrhage, which led to his death a few days later. Sometime later, suspicion fell on the family. One of Elizabeth's uncles failed a lie detector test. Although the police had no evidence against any of the family members, the media quickly picked up on this topic, and soon articles appeared that wrote about the Smarts' potential guilt. About 2 months after Elizabeth's abduction, Emmanuel decided it was time to bring another wife to the camp. Ultimately, he wanted 350 of them. He already knew who would be the next victim, and this time he chose Elizabeth's cousin, Olivia. In the evening, he went on a mission, but returned alone. When he tried to break into the house, he dropped some object into Olivia's bedroom window, which made so much noise that it woke the girl and her father. As a result, Emmanuel had to flee. The family immediately called the police, but they in turn thought it was just a coincidence. The mosquito net was cut in exactly the same way as in Elizabeth's house. According to the police, it was just a teenage prank. They did not take it seriously and certainly did not think that these things had anything to do with each other. However, the Smart family and their relatives felt less and less safe. Sometime later, Emmanuel, Sia, and Elizabeth began to appear in the city more and more often. They were known to many, considered harmless but strange. Once, although Elizabeth always covered her face, someone recognized her in the library. This was reported to the police, and soon one of the police officers arrived at the scene. He directly asked if her name was Elizabeth Smart, but the girl, out of fear, began to deny everything. And Sia was squeezing her hand very tightly all the time, as if reminding her of the consequences. The policeman wanted the girl to show her face, but at that moment Emmanuel joined the discussion, stating that it did not correspond to their religion. The girl covered her face for religious reasons, and she could not open it just because someone wanted her to. The police officer could not force her to show him her face. Elizabeth thought the officer would be more insistent, that he would do something to save her, but he let them go. A breakthrough in the case came 4 months after Elizabeth's disappearance. When her sister Mary Catherine was looking through the Guinness Book of Records, she had a revelation. After months of wondering who the kidnapper's voice could belong to, she realized where she had heard that voice before. She quickly ran to her parents to tell them about this discovery. It was Manuel, the man who had been in their house before. The parents, full of hope for a speedy resolution of the case, immediately reported it to the police. However, the officers were not thrilled with this information. They did not believe that after all this time, the child suddenly remembered who that voice belonged to. They decided not to publicize the information for now, because they knew nothing about this man. Days passed and the police did not react to the Smarts' lead, until finally Ed Lewis and their relatives decided to take matters into their own hands. They compiled a photo portrait of this man and called a press conference where they showed it. It was already February 2003, 8 months after the teenager's disappearance. Soon after the publication of Brian's photos, The police received a call from a woman who recognized her brother Brian Mitchell in him. Brian Mitchell was born in 1953 in Salt Lake City. He grew up in a very religious Mormon family. From quite an early age, the boy began to show interest in the opposite sex. His favorite game was playing doctor, but the parents of the children he played with began to point out the boy's inappropriate behavior during these games. At the age of 16, he was caught in the company of a child, for which he was sent to a correctional institution. 3 years later, Brian married a girl 3 years younger than him. They had 2 children, but the marriage did not last long. The man had quite big problems with alcohol, which made him behave aggressively. After the divorce, Brian became involved with a woman who already had 3 children. After the wedding, 2 more were born, but this marriage also ended in divorce. After that, Brian married Wanda Barzi. She was an elderly divorced woman with 6 children, whom they described as a monster. When they were little, she gave them a rabbit they kept at home for dinner. Brian and Wanda belonged to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Sometime later, Brian declared himself a prophet and took the name Emmanuel. He tried to become like Jesus, grew a beard, and began to wear clothes like Jesus. His wife Wanda followed her husband's decisions. She began to wear exactly the same clothes as him and changed her name to Hephzibah. At first they traveled around the United States, but eventually returned to their hometown to preach the Word of God. They lived in the woods, and suddenly after some time, Brian heard the voice of God telling him that he should have more wives, only they should be younger women than his wife. Since he could not find anyone willing to marry him, he decided to kidnap a girl. When he was about to break into the Smart's house, he began to have some doubts. But then Wanda said that if God wants Elizabeth to be his wife, he will help him in this. The investigators already knew the possible name of the kidnapper and his appearance, but they had photographs taken before Brian had a long beard. However, soon Wanda's children realized that the man who had kidnapped Elizabeth could be their mother's husband, and provided the police with many photographs in which Brian had a beard. After Brian's photographs were made public, the police began to receive reports from people who had previously seen him and Wanda in the company of another person, who could be Elizabeth. The search for the man began, but Elizabeth and her kidnappers were no longer in Salt Lake City. In October, they boarded a bus and headed to San Diego, California. The climate there was milder, and it was easier for them to spend the winter in the woods. In that city, Brian was even arrested for breaking into a church, but the state police did not know that he was wanted, and he was quickly released. Elizabeth realized that she needed to do something to get closer to home, where she would most likely be recognized. She decided to use the same weapon as Emmanuel. She told him that God had spoken to her and said that they should return to Salt Lake City. To her surprise, the man agreed, and on March 12, 2003, they boarded a bus to their hometown. Elizabeth always wore a gray wig and sunglasses, thanks to which no one should have recognized her. They got off on the outskirts of the city and headed along the roadside. When a passing woman recognized Brian, she immediately called the emergency services. The police quickly arrived at the scene. They immediately noticed the girl's disguise. When they began to talk to them, Brian introduced himself with fictitious names and said that the woman with him was his wife and daughter. But the police knew that he was exactly the man they were looking for and were not going to give up so quickly. They tried to get confirmation from Elizabeth that she was the kidnapped teenager, but the girl denied everything. Only when they separated her from the kidnappers did she admit that she was the one they were looking for. She had spent 9 months in hell and had finally found salvation. Ed and Lewis were asked to come to the police station as soon as possible in March. No one told him what it was about. He did not know what to expect. Only on the spot was he told that his daughter had most likely been found. The man was shocked. He looked at the girl standing in front of him and could not believe that this was his daughter. Only when Elizabeth confirmed that it was really her did he hug her, and tears began to flow down his cheeks. Brian and Wanda were arrested, but the trial did not begin immediately, as for a long time they were considered insane and could not participate in the process. Both spent 6 years in a psychiatric hospital. Wanda's trial only began in 2009. The woman immediately confessed to everything, for which she was sentenced to 15 years in prison. In 2010, after numerous examinations by different psychiatrists, it was finally decided that Brian could also stand trial. During almost every court hearing, The man continued to prove with shouts and singing that his mental health was still not in order. However, this was how he behaved only in court. Upon returning to his cell, his behavior was normal. No one had any doubts that he had been faking a mental illness the whole time. In May 2011, he was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. Returning home, Elizabeth quickly returned to a normal life. And a few weeks later, together with her parents, she went to the place where she had been held. Her mother made it clear to her that she could not dwell on what had happened, that she could not let those 9 months nullify her entire life. Her mother's words allowed her to cope with the trauma of these nightmarish experiences. The girl returned to school, which she graduated from in 2006. The same year, Elizabeth went to Paris. In that city, she met a guy named Matthew. He was from Scotland. Elizabeth and Matthew quickly fell in love with each other and got married 3 years later. At the moment, they are parents of 3 children. Immediately after returning home, the girl did not tell the public exactly what had happened from the moment of her abduction to the day of her rescue. However, after a few years, she matured to tell her story to people. She knew that it could help others, so she became a motivational speaker. She speaks at conferences dedicated to the kidnapping of minors. She herself did not know how to behave towards the kidnappers and wants her story to help other people who find themselves in the same situation as Elizabeth once was. In 2011, she received an award for women who help others. In addition to the award, she also received $50,000, which she used to create a foundation in her name, the purpose of which is to support affected children and their families. In September 2018, Wanda Barzee was released after 9 years in prison. It turned out that the day she was supposed to be released from prison had been previously miscalculated without taking into account the time spent in a psychiatric institution. Elizabeth protested against this, believing that she posed a danger to society, but her opinion was not taken into account. Now Wanda is free and lives in Salt Lake City, 600 meters from an elementary school. Elizabeth Smart's story reveals a terrifying truth about the false sense of security in our homes. The fateful decision to turn off the alarm that night seems like a simple coincidence, but it reflects a typical mistake that thousands of families make. We sacrifice safety for convenience. The tragedy could have been prevented not only by setting the alarm, but also by more thorough background checks of the people allowed into the house. Mitchell came into their lives through ordinary kindness. $5 handed to a beggar, a business card with a job offer. Such kindness is natural, but it should not turn off our vigilance. The behavior of 9-year-old Mary, who witnessed the abduction but remained silent for almost 2 hours, shows how important it is to teach children to act in critical situations. Fear paralyzed her, just as later it paralyzed Elizabeth. This is a natural reaction of a child's psyche to a deadly threat. When a knife is held to the throat, when they threaten to kill the whole family, no learned safety rules work. The criminal used the most powerful weapon, fear for loved ones. Particularly alarming is the fact that even when Elizabeth appeared in public places, even when she was recognized, she could not ask for help. This is not just fear. It is a deep psychological subordination that Mitchell created through religious manipulation and constant threats. The incident in the library shows how important it is for the police to be persistent when it comes to missing children. One more insistent question could have saved months of suffering. This story teaches us that the modern security system must be comprehensive. It is not enough just to lock the doors and turn on the alarm. We need surveillance cameras covering all approaches to the house. We need thorough background checks of everyone who crosses the threshold of your home. We need to teach children not just to shout stranger, but to act even in a state of shock. We need to explain to them that some familiar people can be more dangerous than strangers. Elizabeth's story ended in a rescue thanks to the incredible attentiveness of her younger sister, who was able to remember the voice months later. This reminds us of the importance of trusting children, listening to them, and taking their words seriously. The police initially did not believe Mary's memories of the kidnapper's voice. This is a typical mistake that could have cost several more months of nightmare. Today, when Wanda Barzee lives 600 meters from an elementary school, we must remember, the threat does not disappear, it only changes form. Our task is not to frighten our children, but to teach them to be attentive, to trust their instincts, and to always have a plan of action in a critical situation. Every family should regularly check their security systems and discuss with their children scenarios of possible dangerous situations. If this story made you think about the safety of your children, subscribe to my channel Detective Brooks Stories, where I continue to analyze real cases and extract vital lessons from them.